Tsar Alexander II, also known as Alexander the Liberator, was the Tsar from 1855 to 1881. There's been a lot of debate on whether or not Tsar Alexander II had any role to play in the emancipation of the serfs. I have seen both sides of this argument, from he had no influence to he had a lot of influence, and one of my focuses here at Baylor is history, and more specifically Russian history. I have researched and written on this topic extensively, and the research that I have seen draws to a myriad of different conclusions, from again that he had no influence to he had a lot of influence. After hours upon hours upon hours of researching this topic, I've only just recently come to a conclusion whether or not Alexander II had any role within the emancipation of the serfs. I believe that Tsar Alexander II did have a large role in the emancipation of the serfs because he wished to. And he wished to for several reasons. He wished for a military reform after the disastrous defeat of the Russian army in the Crimean War, and that he believed that God called him to do so. Firstly, Alexander II, he simply wanted to free the serfs. All of his actions during this time period point to this conclusion through his letters that he had with his mother, as Pariah writes about in his book Alexander II and the Decision to Emancipate the Russian Serfs. All of his actions support that it suggests, as Pariah writes, that all important decision was not only made by the Tsar, but that they were a true reflection of his feelings and aspirations. These decisions being that he moved forward with the emancipation reform after the initial backlash of the nobles. And he also, Pariah says, that he may have not have caused the reform to get started, but he definitely made them get passed. And what is generally accepted to be the causal incident of the reforms is the Crimean War. And this is because that reform at was necessary. As Bartlett writes in his Serfdom and State Power in Imperial Russia, he writes that the Imperial Russian Standing Army successfully divided peasant soldiers with military experience from the civilian population, and that it was this fact above all others which brought Tsar Alexander II to embrace the abolition of serfdom in 1856. This is because when a war would happen, they would have to conscript peasants and they would have to be taught military training, and then they would go on to live the rest of their life until they were old men in the military. And this is something that Tsar Alexander II wanted to change, as Bartlett writes, and because these peasants could not go home, because the reason why they couldn't go home was because you do not want a military trained peasants who would want to revolt all the time, and they would put down crushing revolts a lot harder. And something that Bartlett writes that I disagree with is that the self-interest of the government and because the nobles wanted to. Pariah writes pretty extensively that many nobles did not want to, and the fact of the servile economy. So the servile economy is basically a feudal system, the way that medieval Europe worked. And what Bartlett writes is that the servile economy gave social and economic organization and control of the peasants to the noblemen. And this is something that Tsar Alexander II personally himself wanted to change, but I disagree with Bartlett that the nobles also wished for this to happen. Finally, Alexander was wanting to get control of a situation that was bound to happen anyway, that being the emancipation of the serfs, that but he wanted to get a control of the situation and allow it to happen and be seen as the Tsar liberator. This ties back to Pariah's that he wished to emancipate the serfs because, as Wortman writes in Scenarios of Power, Myth, and Ceremony in the Russian Monarchy from Peter the Great to the Abdication of Nicholas II, in the Tsar Emancipator chapter, he writes that 1 year after he was coronated, Tsar Alexander II requested the nobility to come forth with proposals for emancipation. This is because Tsar Alexander simply, again, he wished to free the serfs. But the aspect of him wanting to is then goes back to why did he want to? I believe it's because he felt like God to do so. And Wortman explains on this pretty well, in my opinion. Wortman writes, By presenting emancipation as an expression of the emotional and personal bond between monarchy and nobility, Alexander made the reform irresistible. To oppose it, they would have to challenge or violate the love and devotion the nobility were supposed to feel for their sovereign. This ties back into that he felt that God himself called himself to do it. In his letters, as previously mentioned, he wrote about how God wished him to free the serfs, and this would be a big deal because at the time the Russian Tsar was the head of the Orthodox Church, and because he was the head of the Orthodox Church, that meant he was the closest to God in the Russian Orthodox Church. And to go against the Tsar would be to go against God, which is not a good thing to do in the 19th century Russia. So again, I believe that Tsar Alexander II did play a large role in the emancipation of the serfs because he wanted to. He, with the desire of military reform, and that he felt that God was calling him to free the serfs. And I think those are the two biggest reasons that Tsar Alexander II wished to free the serfs. Thank you.